Welcome to Conspiracy Files. I'm your host, Zoe Parker, and in today's episode, we turn our attention to a world cloaked in quiet observation. From street cameras and facial recognition to data collection and predictive policing, how much of our daily life is actually being monitored? Is it protection, control, or something far more calculated? Tonight, we pull back the digital curtain and ask the forbidden question: how deep does the surveillance really go? The roots of mass surveillance stretch far beyond modern-day technology. To understand how we arrived at a world of omnipresent observation, we must look back to the early foundations of surveillance in both statecraft and warfare. Ancient civilizations used primitive methods to monitor citizens and adversaries. In ancient China, imperial agents gathered information on regional governors to ensure loyalty to the emperor. In the Roman Empire, spies embedded in both military and civilian life helped maintain control across a sprawling territory. But it was during the 20th century that surveillance evolved into a formalized instrument of political power. The aftermath of the First World War saw the rise of national intelligence agencies, and the Second World War accelerated their growth. Surveillance was no longer a military tool alone. It became central to political stability and social control. In the United States, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, laid the groundwork for global monitoring networks. In the Soviet Union, the KGB maintained one of the most expansive domestic spy apparatuses ever assembled, recording conversations, monitoring letters, and planting informants across neighborhoods and workplaces. The Cold War brought paranoia to new heights. Intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain engaged in psychological operations, wiretaps, satellite reconnaissance, and human surveillance on a scale never seen before. Fear of ideological subversion gave governments justification to track their own citizens. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO program targeted activists, civil rights leaders, and political dissidents throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Files were kept on thousands of Americans, many of whom had never committed any crime. As computers emerged in the late 20th century, the nature of surveillance changed again. Analog tape recorders and physical archives gave way to digital storage and real-time data collection. Intelligence agencies began using early internet infrastructure to collect communications metadata and eavesdrop on international transmissions. The National Security Agency, once a shadowy presence in American defense, grew rapidly in both size and capability. Its mandate expanded from foreign signals interception to comprehensive data mining, email monitoring, and voice recording, all under the justification of national security. Simultaneously, private corporations began collecting data for commercial purposes. Loyalty cards, credit reports, and early online browsing records were harvested, analyzed, and sold. By the early 2000s, the line between corporate and governmental surveillance began to blur. Information willingly given to tech platforms often found its way to intelligence services through back channels, partnerships, or secret agreements. The September 11th attacks in 2001 marked a turning point. What had once been considered intrusive became normalized under the banner of anti-terrorism. Governments around the world passed sweeping laws that vastly expanded surveillance powers. But as the infrastructure grew more invisible and sophisticated, a critical question began to emerge. Was this truly about safety or something else? The roots of mass surveillance stretch far beyond modern-day technology. To understand how we arrived at a world of omnipresent observation, we must look back to the early foundations of surveillance in both statecraft and warfare. Ancient civilizations used primitive methods to monitor citizens and adversaries. In ancient China, imperial agents gathered information on regional governors to ensure loyalty to the emperor. In the Roman Empire, spies embedded in both military and civilian life helped maintain control across a sprawling territory. But it was during the 20th century that surveillance evolved into a formalized instrument of political power. The aftermath of the First World War saw the rise of national intelligence agencies, and the Second World War accelerated their growth. Surveillance was no longer a military tool alone. It became central to political stability and social control. In the United States, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, laid the groundwork for global monitoring networks. In the Soviet Union, the KGB maintained one of the most expansive domestic spy apparatuses ever assembled, recording conversations, monitoring letters, and planting informants across neighborhoods and workplaces. The Cold War brought paranoia to new heights. Intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain engaged in psychological operations, wiretaps, satellite reconnaissance, and human surveillance on a scale never seen before. Fear of ideological subversion gave governments justification to track their own citizens. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO program targeted activists, civil rights leaders, and political dissidents throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Files were kept on thousands of Americans, many of whom had never committed any crime. As computers emerged in the late 20th century, the nature of surveillance changed again. Analog tape recorders and physical archives gave way to digital storage and real-time data collection. Intelligence agencies began using early internet infrastructure to collect communications metadata and eavesdrop on international transmissions. The National Security Agency, once a shadowy presence in American defense, grew rapidly in both size and capability. Its mandate expanded from foreign signals interception to comprehensive data mining, email monitoring, and voice recording, all under the justification of national security. Simultaneously, private corporations began collecting data for commercial purposes. Loyalty cards, credit reports, and early online browsing records were harvested, analyzed, and sold. By the early 2000s, the line between corporate and governmental surveillance began to blur. Information willingly given to tech platforms often found its way to intelligence services through back channels, partnerships, or secret agreements. The September 11th attacks in 2001 marked a turning point. What had once been considered intrusive became normalized under the banner of anti-terrorism. Governments around the world passed sweeping laws that vastly expanded surveillance powers. But as the infrastructure grew more invisible and sophisticated, a critical question began to emerge. Was this truly about safety or something else? One of the most pivotal figures in the modern surveillance narrative is Edward Snowden. In the summer of 2013, Snowden, a former contractor for the National Security Agency, released a series of classified documents to journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. What these documents revealed was staggering: a sprawling network of domestic and international surveillance programs, many operating in secret and beyond public oversight. The disclosures included programs like PRISM, which allowed the National Security Agency direct access to user data from major tech companies, including emails, chat logs, and file transfers. Another, called XKeyscore, functioned like a search engine for intercepted internet data, enabling analysts to comb through vast amounts of information on virtually anyone in the world. The revelation that the National Security Agency had tapped undersea fiber optic cables and monitored global leaders, including allies, sent shockwaves through the international community. Snowden's leak sparked global outrage and forced the public to confront the scale of modern surveillance. The notion that ordinary citizens were not just being watched, but systematically logged, indexed, and profiled shattered long-held beliefs about privacy and constitutional protection. Snowden became both a hero and a traitor, depending on whom one asked. For supporters, he exposed an illegal overreach of power. For critics, he endangered national security and global intelligence operations. The United States was not the only country implicated. Programs similar to those of the National Security Agency were identified in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, operating collectively under what is known as the Five Eyes Alliance. These nations, through interwoven intelligence agreements, had established an informal surveillance empire that extended across borders, circumventing national privacy laws through information sharing. Key institutions played significant roles in facilitating this network. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, largely unknown to the public before Snowden's disclosures, was found to have secretly authorized mass data collection, operating with limited transparency and almost no public accountability. At the corporate level, companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft were accused of either cooperating with or failing to resist government demands for user data. Some denied involvement, others claimed they were compelled by law. Snowden's documents also revealed that mobile devices could be used as passive tracking tools, with location data harvested and stored for future analysis. Even inactive phones could serve as microphones, cameras, and location beacons. These revelations shifted the conversation from targeted surveillance to mass surveillance, where everyone was a potential subject, regardless of guilt or suspicion. The fallout from these disclosures was immediate. Laws were amended, debates ignited, and whistleblower protections re-examined. But many programs continued quietly, rebranded or restructured to avoid scrutiny. Snowden's role in the conspiracy narrative is central, not because he created the system, but because he lifted the veil just long enough for the world to glimpse its true scale. His actions forced the question: if they can watch everyone, will they choose not to? The evidence supporting the existence of a vast and interconnected surveillance state is both abundant and unsettling. At its core lies the infrastructure itself, an invisible web of satellites, fiber optic cables, server farms, facial recognition cameras, smart devices, and data centers that form a surveillance ecosystem capable of tracking individuals in real time. While much of this infrastructure is visible in the form of cell towers and security cameras, its true power is hidden in the algorithms and back-end systems that process unimaginable volumes of personal data every second. One of the clearest indicators of surveillance expansion has been the global rise of facial recognition technology. Deployed across major cities, transportation hubs, and public venues, facial recognition cameras scan and identify individuals using biometric markers stored in growing databases. In China, the system is used to monitor citizen behavior as part of a social credit framework. In the United States, law enforcement agencies have quietly adopted similar tools, with companies like Clearview AI scraping billions of images from social media platforms to feed into their systems. These databases can link a single face to names, locations, online activity, and even political affiliations. Location tracking is another pillar of the surveillance apparatus. Smartphones, wearable devices, and connected vehicles continuously broadcast their position via GPS, Bluetooth, and cellular signals. In 2020, it was revealed that several mobile apps, including seemingly harmless ones like weather apps and games, had been selling real-time location data to third-party brokers, many of whom had ties to government agencies. This data can be used to map movement patterns, identify associations between individuals, and monitor participation in protests or politically sensitive gatherings. Online behavior forms another critical layer of surveillance. Every website visited, search term entered, and message sent contributes to a digital footprint that is stored, analyzed, and often sold. Major tech firms operate under business models that depend on data harvesting, profiling users to serve targeted ads. However, the same behavioral data can be accessed by law enforcement and intelligence agencies, often through secretive legal requests or under the guise of national security. Smart home devices, such as voice assistants, security systems, and internet-connected appliances, represent a newer frontier. These devices are always listening for activation cues, and in many cases, recordings are stored remotely and transcribed by third parties. Television sets, smart thermostats, and even light bulbs have been shown to transmit usage data back to manufacturers. The notion that one's home is a sanctuary of privacy is increasingly outdated. Perhaps most disturbingly, predictive policing software now allows authorities to forecast where crimes are likely to occur based on aggregated surveillance data. These algorithms factor in historical crime data, social media activity, and demographic information to make decisions that can shape patrol routes, prioritize suspects, and justify increased monitoring of certain neighborhoods. Critics argue that such systems reinforce existing biases, creating feedback loops that disproportionately target marginalized communities. The picture that emerges from these layers of evidence is not one of isolated tools, but of an integrated system designed to collect, interpret, and act upon human behavior at scale. From city streets to private bedrooms, the watchful eye of the surveillance state grows more sophisticated with each passing year, leaving behind an uncomfortable question: is privacy becoming obsolete by design? To assess the credibility of the surveillance claims, we must look closely at how the systems function and what has been officially acknowledged. One of the most well-documented programs is PRISM, exposed by Edward Snowden, which allowed the National Security Agency to collect data directly from the servers of major tech companies. While companies such as Google and Microsoft initially denied direct access, leaked documents showed that the National Security Agency had developed legal pathways, such as Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, to compel cooperation. This program was not speculative. It was verified through internal memos, government slides, and legal filings. Another case involves the use of stingrays, or cell site simulators, which mimic cell towers to intercept mobile communications. Law enforcement agencies across the United States, including local police departments, were found to be using these devices without warrants. In 2015, the Department of Justice admitted to using airborne surveillance equipment over multiple American cities. Legal analysts confirmed that these devices could collect data from thousands of phones simultaneously, often without the knowledge of courts or oversight bodies. The verification of these tools comes not only from whistleblower documents, but also from internal audits, court rulings, and declassified reports. In 2021, a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court opinion revealed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had misused surveillance databases thousands of times, including for inquiries into protesters, political donors, and journalists. These findings were made public through legally required transparency reports, though they were rarely covered in depth by mainstream outlets. Commercial surveillance has also been confirmed through investigative journalism. A report by the Wall Street Journal revealed that over 1,000 apps were sending user data to third-party firms, sometimes including sensitive financial, health, or geolocation information. In some cases, this data was purchased by defense contractors or passed on to government agencies under the justification of homeland security or threat analysis. Several court cases have tested the legality of bulk data collection. In 2015, a federal appeals court ruled that the National Security Agency's bulk phone metadata collection was unlawful and likely unconstitutional. The court determined that the collection of millions of Americans' phone records without individual warrants was not supported by statutory authority. Despite this ruling, surveillance programs were often restructured rather than dismantled, continuing under different names or legal justifications. Independent researchers have replicated surveillance capabilities in academic environments to test the limits of publicly available technology. In one experiment, a group of data scientists successfully tracked a volunteer's location and social circle using nothing more than metadata collected from mobile apps. Their conclusion was simple but powerful. With the right access, complete behavioral profiles can be constructed without ever needing to read a single message. These findings offer more than anecdotal proof. They present a clear pattern. From courtroom admissions and leaked documents to scientific replications and public testimony, the claims of mass surveillance are not rumors, but supported realities. The challenge is not proving that surveillance happens. It is understanding the full extent of what remains hidden behind classification, legal complexity, and corporate silence. While the volume of supporting evidence is substantial, not all observers agree on the interpretation or implications. Critics of mass surveillance theories argue that many programs are mischaracterized or misunderstood. According to official statements from intelligence agencies and legislative bodies, most data collection is conducted within legal boundaries and is subject to oversight, however limited that may be. Defenders of these systems assert that they are vital tools in national security, preventing terrorism, cyber attacks, and organized crime through early detection and threat analysis. Some privacy experts suggest that much of what is called surveillance is actually data collection driven by commercial interests. They argue that while government access to this data is concerning, The primary purpose of most tracking technologies is monetization rather than control. Advertising networks, for example, use behavioral data to serve personalized content and influence consumer habits. While this data may be accessible to law enforcement through subpoenas or national security letters, it is not always collected with that intent. Skeptics also point to the distinction between metadata and content. Intelligence agencies often emphasize that what is collected is metadata: who contacted whom, when, and for how long, rather than the actual contents of messages or phone calls. They argue that metadata, while sensitive, is less intrusive than direct surveillance of conversations or private files. However, critics of this position note that metadata alone can be just as revealing, painting a detailed picture of a person's habits, associations, and movements. Legal scholars have raised questions about the interpretation of laws that govern surveillance, particularly those passed after September 11th. The USA Patriot Act, for instance, expanded surveillance powers significantly, but included provisions for limited transparency. Civil liberties organizations argue that these provisions are too vague, allowing for broad interpretations that enable bulk data collection without explicit congressional approval or public debate. While some aspects of these laws have been reformed, others remain in force under new names and legal frameworks. There are also technical limitations that challenge the idea of total surveillance. Data overload is a persistent problem. Collecting massive amounts of information creates an analytical burden. Identifying real threats among billions of data points requires enormous computing resources and still involves human judgment. Intelligence agencies have acknowledged that in some cases, too much data has hindered rather than helped investigations. Missed warnings before major incidents, such as the Boston Marathon bombing, are sometimes cited as examples of intelligence failures despite widespread data access. Moreover, some whistleblowers have faced criticism not for the content of their disclosures, but for the perceived damage to national security. Edward Snowden, for example, was accused of revealing operational details that adversaries could exploit. Skeptics of his actions argue that transparency must be balanced against the need for secrecy in active intelligence operations. Others claim that public reaction to the revelations was overblown, driven more by fear than fact. Ultimately, the skepticism surrounding mass surveillance reflects a larger debate: the balance between security and freedom, privacy and progress. While not all claims about surveillance are confirmed, and some may be exaggerated, the underlying concern, that powerful systems operate beyond public oversight, remains at the heart of the controversy. Whether one views these tools as necessary protection or creeping authoritarianism often depends less on the facts themselves and more on the philosophical lens through which they are viewed. Mass surveillance, whether justified or contested, carries significant cultural and psychological weight. Its presence, even when invisible, alters how people think, behave, and interact with the world around them. The mere knowledge or suspicion that one might be watched creates what sociologists call the panopticon effect, where individuals self-regulate their behavior out of fear of observation. This concept, once confined to theoretical models of prisons and power structures, now extends into everyday life through cameras, algorithms, and silent data harvesting. In democratic societies, the tension between privacy and security becomes especially pronounced. The notion that governments may monitor their own citizens in pursuit of order raises deep questions about the nature of freedom. When citizens are surveilled not because of individual suspicion, but as part of a blanket strategy to preempt threats, the very definition of civil liberty begins to shift. Critics argue that this inversion of the legal norm, where everyone is treated as potentially guilty, undermines the foundational principles of due process and personal autonomy. The political implications are equally profound. Surveillance capabilities grant governments an unprecedented level of insight into public opinion, activism, and dissent. Political organizers and protest movements often report feeling targeted by surveillance tactics, whether through facial recognition at demonstrations, monitoring of online event pages, or infiltration of digital messaging groups. In some countries, this extends to outright repression, where known dissidents are tracked detained, or punished based on their associations and digital footprints. The psychological toll should not be underestimated. Studies have shown that environments of surveillance foster anxiety, self-censorship, and mistrust. People may avoid researching certain topics, joining particular groups, or expressing controversial views online, not because they fear immediate punishment, but because they feel watched. This silent inhibition can reshape public discourse, narrowing the range of ideas and perspectives that emerge in the digital public square. Corporate participation in surveillance has also influenced consumer culture. The normalization of terms of service agreements, which often include clauses permitting broad data use, has conditioned users to accept trade-offs between convenience and privacy. Services such as voice assistants, smart appliances, and fitness trackers become ubiquitous not only because they are useful, but because the social cost of opting out becomes higher. Those who reject digital devices or social platforms risk marginalization in both professional and personal spheres. In the educational system, surveillance is increasingly embedded into the learning environment. Proctoring software, keystroke monitoring, and attendance tracking through facial recognition are being implemented in schools and universities. Proponents argue these measures ensure academic integrity and safety. Critics suggest they instill a culture of compliance and normalize surveillance from an early age, conditioning younger generations to accept monitoring as part of life. Cultural storytelling has also shifted. Films, novels, and television increasingly depict surveillance as a backdrop to dystopian worlds, reflecting a growing public unease. Yet these portrayals are not always cautionary. Some celebrate the capabilities of intelligent systems in the fight against evil. This dual messaging complicates public understanding, blending fear with admiration and making it harder to distinguish between warning and endorsement. The broader implication is clear. Mass surveillance does not only exist in technical or legal domains. It penetrates the human psyche, reshapes democratic processes, and redefines the boundaries of private life. In doing so, it becomes not just a system of observation, but a force that molds society from within. The presence of mass surveillance has significantly shaped how information is presented, controlled, and interpreted in the media. Mainstream coverage of surveillance issues often walks a fine line between acknowledgement and avoidance. When stories about whistleblowers, leaked documents, or new technologies emerge, they are frequently framed within national security or technological innovation narratives rather than examined for their implications on civil liberties and individual autonomy. This subtle reframing helps to normalize invasive practices by casting them as inevitable progress or justified defense. At the same time, alternative media and independent investigative outlets have played a pivotal role in highlighting the scope of mass surveillance. Journalists like Glenn Greenwald and documentaries like Citizenfour helped expose the human dimension of these systems, giving voice to individuals caught within the machinery of surveillance. However, these sources often face discreditation, censorship, or limited reach due to content moderation policies on social media platforms and video sharing sites. Algorithms used by major platforms sometimes suppress visibility for topics flagged as conspiratorial, even when the reporting is based on verifiable facts. This creates a feedback loop where challenging narratives become harder to find, reinforcing public apathy or confusion. Fictional media has also become a vehicle for shaping perception. Shows like Black Mirror and Person of Interest dramatize the consequences of a fully connected surveillance infrastructure, turning abstract concerns into compelling storylines. While these depictions increase awareness, they can also desensitize audiences by turning dystopian elements into entertainment. As a result, viewers may become familiar with surveillance concepts without fully engaging with their real-world implications. Social media platforms themselves are both subjects and instruments of surveillance. Companies like Meta and Google have access to intimate behavioral data and often cooperate with governments under legal requests. Meanwhile, these same platforms have reshaped public dialogue, where users are encouraged to document their lives in real time, unwittingly contributing to data profiles that can be mined for insights. The architecture of likes, shares, and engagement metrics favors content that stimulates reaction, often at the expense of nuance or critical thought. Within this environment, discussions about surveillance become fragmented, polarized, or lost in the stream of constant information. Public responses to surveillance vary widely depending on how media frames the issue. When surveillance is presented as a tool for catching criminals or thwarting terrorism, acceptance increases. When portrayed as invasive or unconstitutional, resistance grows, but only among those already inclined to be skeptical. The result is a divided information landscape in which consensus is difficult, and disinformation can flourish. Governments and corporations often capitalize on this fragmentation by shaping narratives in their favor, using media consultants, think tanks, and legal euphemisms to soften or obscure the reality of surveillance programs. Activist groups and civil rights organizations have attempted to counter this influence through awareness campaigns, digital privacy toolkits, and litigation. Campaigns encouraging users to encrypt their communications, avoid certain platforms, or adopt privacy-first technologies have gained some traction. Still, adoption remains limited, often due to convenience, technical barriers, or a belief that personal privacy is already compromised beyond repair. In this context, media does more than report on surveillance. It helps determine how society understands it. The lines between watchdog journalism, government influence, and algorithmic shaping have blurred, making it harder to discern who controls the narrative. As surveillance becomes more embedded in daily life, the role of media is not merely to inform, but to condition how that information is received, questioned, or ignored. Beyond the verified systems and acknowledged programs lies a landscape of more speculative, fringe, and often unsettling claims about the true extent of surveillance technology. These ideas, while often dismissed by mainstream sources, continue to circulate through alternative research communities, anonymous whistleblowers, and declassified yet obscure government documents. Some believe that what the public knows represents only the surface. Beneath it exists a far more advanced and opaque system of control. One of the most persistent fringe theories involves the concept of total neural surveillance. According to this view, emerging technologies have already enabled governments or private entities to monitor not just external behaviors, but internal thought patterns. Some researchers point to patents involving brain-computer interfaces, non-invasive neuroimaging, and electromagnetic mind-reading techniques as evidence that the groundwork is being laid, or has already been deployed, for real-time monitoring of cognition. Though mainstream science views such capabilities as years or decades away, others argue that classified military research is consistently far ahead of the public domain. Another controversial claim involves nanosurveillance, microscopic technologies allegedly introduced into the human body through food, medicine, or environmental exposure. Proponents of this theory cite advancements in nanotechnology and biosensing devices capable of measuring internal states like stress levels, hormone activity, or even subconscious impulses. These nano devices, once activated, could potentially transmit data wirelessly to nearby receivers or cloud-based analytics systems, forming a mesh network of internal surveillance invisible to the human eye. Fringe circles have also speculated on so-called digital doubles, or detailed behavioral avatars created by surveillance AI systems. These doubles, built from a person's digital activity, facial recognition data, and biometric inputs, could hypothetically be used to simulate future decisions, test psychological responses, or even impersonate individuals online. Some believe that such models are already used in predictive law enforcement, influence operations, or remote interrogation protocols. The use of sound-based surveillance has been another area of deep suspicion. Known as voice-to-skull technology, certain documents from military research archives reference the possibility of transmitting sound directly into the auditory cortex using microwave or ultrasonic frequencies. While the official narrative positions these experiments as theoretical or non-operational, some believe these technologies have been quietly tested or deployed in limited ways. Allegations of such use have emerged in cases involving targeted individuals, people who claim to be subjected to non-consensual surveillance or psychological manipulation campaigns. Even infrastructure developments have drawn scrutiny. The rise of smart cities, urban environments embedded with sensors, cameras, and automated systems, has been hailed as a step toward efficient, data-driven governance. But critics worry that such cities represent the final form of centralized control, where human activity is not only measured, but shaped through algorithmic feedback. Traffic lights, energy usage, trash collection, and even water consumption could be used to infer personal behavior, triggering automated interventions or restrictions without human oversight. Whether these claims reflect hidden truths, misinterpretations, or speculative extrapolation, their persistence signals a deep mistrust in institutions and an awareness that what is visible may be only part of the story. As official technologies become more advanced and less transparent, the line between fact and possibility becomes harder to draw. In that gray area, fringe theories flourish, not always because they are true, but because they reflect a growing sense that something critical is being concealed. As the threads of this complex narrative come together, one truth emerges. The age of anonymity is rapidly disappearing. Surveillance has evolved from a limited, targeted tool into a diffuse and often invisible system that touches nearly every aspect of modern life. What was once a subject of speculative fiction has become a routine feature of city streets, corporate offices, social media platforms, and even private homes. Cameras recognize faces, devices record voices, algorithms interpret thoughts, intentions, and behaviors. Whether intended for safety, efficiency, or control, the effect remains the same. The human experience is increasingly monitored, measured, and modeled. The scope of this transformation is not confined to government halls or intelligence agencies. It extends into every app downloaded, every keystroke logged, every voice command given to a smart device. For many, surveillance is no longer something to fear. It is something to accept or even embrace. It offers convenience, personalization, and a sense of security in a chaotic world. Yet that same acceptance comes at a cost. It blurs the boundaries between voluntary participation and passive compliance, between informed consent and engineered dependence. There are those who continue to resist, choosing encryption over exposure, analog over digital, and silence over broadcast. But resistance itself becomes a signal, a behavior that systems are designed to flag, question, or neutralize. In a world where visibility equates to vulnerability, even the act of opting out becomes a data point. The illusion of choice remains, but the structure behind it grows more rigid with each innovation. Laws and ethics lag behind technology. While legal systems debate the boundaries of privacy, the surveillance apparatus marches forward, often without pause or public discussion. Oversight mechanisms exist, but many operate in secrecy or depend on institutions that are themselves enmeshed in the surveillance ecosystem. The line between public interest and institutional self-preservation becomes increasingly difficult to define. And so the question remains, not whether we are being watched, but how deeply, how continuously, and by whom. Is the surveillance state a necessary shield against real dangers, or has it become a subtle mechanism of influence and control? Does it protect democracy or quietly reshape it? These questions have no simple answers. They demand not only vigilance, but imagination, a willingness to question the systems we live within and envision alternatives before the current structure becomes irreversible. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Conspiracy Files. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show and unlock bonus content, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.